Hello everybody, my name is Thorsten Havler and I'm a professor at ETH Zurich, and I'm going to talk about the three pillars of large-scale deep learning today. That is actually also a large-scale effort in my lab, so many people are involved in it. So Tal Ben-Nun, Shigang Li, Nicolai Dryden, and many others, and even external collaborators like Dan Alistar. So I'm going to give a whirlwind overview in the next about 30 minutes over various topics of what it means to train at extremely large scale, so on the supercomputer scale, very large models. So without further ado, let me start right away to talk about the three pillars and then dive deeply into each of those pillars. But what is very large scale deep learning? So very large scale deep learning means we need extremely large models. And traditionally, models have not been extremely large, so CNNs are of moderate size and even fit a single GPU. But in the recent past, generative pre-trained transformers, so-called GPT or even BERT-style models, like we see here in the top right, are growing larger and larger in size, so that they actually need a supercomputer to be trained, because they wouldn't just fit into a single accelerator, because they have multiple gigabytes or even terabytes of parameters necessary to be trained. This is why most of this talk is somewhat generic for deep learning, but much of it actually applies to transformer networks as we are seeing here in the middle, cartoonish. But let me talk about the three pillars of deep learning first. So first, you need high performance input-output. So the volume of data is growing. As you know, deep learning is mostly driven by the revolution of deep learning was mostly driven by three aspects. So one is the availability of data, which is what we are talking about here. The second one is the availability of compute, which is our second pillar. And the third one is the availability of algorithms. So this has not been changing in the last years. So the availability of data drives the necessity of high performance input-output devices. Especially in scientific computing, we have extremely large data volumes. So terabytes of climate data, or even petabytes of climate data we have today in archives of the ECMWF and many other scientific institutions. So the question is now, how can we optimize the input-output of deep learning devices? And one of the answers is to use specifics of machine learning workloads like intelligent prefetching. This is especially important in the context of performance modeling, like we were discussing here, because this performance modeling is simply dependent on how the workload is actually executed. So the second pillar, equally important for performance modeling, is the high performance compute aspect of it. So as I mentioned, two of the three drivers of the revolution of deep learning are covered in this talk at the very large scale. So my view, very briefly summarized in 4 words, is deep learning is high performance computing, or HPC. So the the workload is very similar, and we are in both types of computation, so large scale deep learning as well as high performance computing, limited by data movement in the workload, or mostly limited by data movement. And the last one, also very dear to an HPC expert's heart, is high performance communication. Because of course, now as we scale deep learning workloads up to tens of thousands of GPUs, as Microsoft has shown, we have deployed a very large cluster for deep learning and publicly announced the $1 billion of support for OpenAI, partially probably implemented with this cluster. So you need to run now deep learning workloads in parallel on tens of thousands of GPUs or other accelerators. And model parallelism is one of the most important forms of parallelism in that context, because if your model does not fit on a single accelerator, you have to distribute it across various accelerators. And there are different ways of doing this. I'm going to talk about this in the next couple of minutes, but one of those are complex pipelining schemes. And another way to deal with this data deluge, somehow parameter deluge, is sparsification, to just not store all the parameters. Okay, so let me dive right into the first pillar, high performance input-output for deep learning. So let me just go through an example, ResNet 50, relatively small model. We need about a 3.8 gigaflop for a single inference and 3 times as much for training, because of course we need a full forward pass, and then the backward pass is about twice as computationally expensive to apply to compute the gradients and apply the gradients, as well as forwarding the errors to the next layer. So if you look at ImageNet, which is the default data set there, it has about 150 gigabyte storage, or 150 gigabyte of images, of raw image data, of course compressed as 1.3 million images. So it means that the average size of an image is 115 kilobyte, but the size range is really from 508 bytes to about 15 megabytes. In fact, if you're wondering what the smallest image in this data set is, it's this one up there. And apparently that is labeled as a nail. I may not have recognized this, but good networks will actually recognize this much better than I do. Then if you look at the standard benchmark like MLPerf on an A100, gets us about 2.9 thousand samples per second. Right? So in a single device, single GPU device, we get 2.9 thousand samples per second, which gives us 333 megabytes of input volume at the average image size. Random access. So my estimation is we would need 2 SSDs per GPU to just load this data. And in fact, the data is 2 to 4 times as big for larger scientific problems as CosmoFlow. So this ImageNet is just kind of the default benchmark. So if you now train on thousands of GPUs, as was actually done in the paper's ImageNet in under a minute, then we would need K times thousands of SSDs. So K being somewhere between 2 and 4. So 2 to 4,000 SSDs. But now, of course, our parallel file systems in parallel computing will support all of this. But the question is, do we need that power of these expensive file systems and that overhead to have POSIX-like access semantics? And the question is, well, if we have random access, is this even a good workload for these file systems? But we need random access because, of course, deep learning workloads, they sample the input randomly. So what can we do? Well, what we can actually do is we can recognize that much of these workloads have random sequences, but these are pseudo-random sequences. So once you select the seed, you can predict the whole sequence until the end of time. And this is interesting because now we can pre-compute the random access, and this enables us clairvoyant prefetching. We don't need many of these mechanisms that these file systems offer. In fact, we have a near optimal prefetching system or prefetching file system, which we call jokingly NoPFS, like no parallel file system, but it really means near optimal prefetching system, because we don't really need all the features of a parallel file system because we can predict pretty much everything and we can implement the ideal caching strategy on top of this file system. So really NoPFS acts as a distributed cache and keeps each node's cache busy and ideally used because it knows everything about the future. So it uses the crystal ball, the clairvoyant prefetching. And now if we look at the access frequency of the samples in ImageNet with 16 processes, for example. So this is a histogram of all the samples binned by their access frequency. So most of the samples are accessed about 6 times here, as you can see, so 4 to 8 times. But there are some samples that are accessed about 18 times, so caching actually plays a significant role. And now you can take this curve and look at the ones at the very right, which are used very often, and put these in local storage. And actually the ones that are used very, very often, you store in very fast storage. So now you can pre-compute for different storage classes which elements, which images, or which examples should go into the storage class optimally. So you can actually figure this out all statically. You just pre-compute the random number sequence, and then you know exactly what is going to be reused in the future. So you can actually, using Bilaty's law, optimize this access. So, well, this is a quite simple scheme, and you can apply it to your favorite deep learning workload. We have done this. We have implemented this. And now run it on the Pitstein supercomputer, which is a machine that was not designed for deep learning. So the file system is not optimal for executing these deep learning workloads. Now we are comparing 3 different implementations. One is PyTorch, one is PyTorch plus DALI. DALI is NVIDIA's loader for data. It makes it slightly faster, as you can see in these diagrams. And then our NoPFS or NoPFS. And so we see that the variance, these are violent plots, so these are essentially the distribution of the data on the vertical. And so the wider the data, here you can see that there is a huge bulk at around 1.8 seconds per batch. But you can also see that the maximum for PyTorch is 100 times larger than the average. So there's a huge variation depending on the file system load. As we all know and nod love, these parallel file systems are actually pretty non-deterministic. But for NoPFS, it actually fits on the scale. So the largest observed value is about 7. So the variation, as opposed to 100x, is only about 3x. So we also tried the same experiment, essentially the same setup on Lassen. Here we did not run the DALI implementation because it was slightly harder to set up. And we see very similar results. On Lassen, we got a much larger scale, 1024 instead of only 256 on the Pitt-Stein supercomputer. We got a 150x as expected. The larger the scale goes, the larger the variation. Variation, while on NoPFS, it was actually again fitting in this very small range here, going about 2x or 2.5x over the average. So NoPFS reduces the variation quite a bit and thus enables faster training over multiple epochs. Here we can see, let's just look at the Lassen results. And this is the total training time for epoch of the ImageNet example on 1024 GPUs. So here PyTorch and here NoPFS, you can see significantly faster, up to a factor of 4 or 5, I believe, faster. Okay, so that was just how can we deal with high performance I/O on deep learning systems. So one particularly effective trick, I would call it, that is very useful in practice. So let's now move to the second pillar, high performance compute. Deep learning is high performance computation, which means that data movement may be all you need. And here we had a little case study on how to optimize transformer networks, the networks I mentioned earlier that are incredibly important for large scale compute for a particular V100 GPU system. So we take the encoder. This is just a visual representation of the deep neural network. This deep neural network is very, very relevant in the industry. It has around 175 billion parameters. It costed $12 million to train a single run. So you can see if people are willing to invest $12 million to train the network just once, that must be quite valuable in practice, and in fact it is. But if you now analyze this network, you will find that there are 3 different types of operations. And one I would call tensor contraction, so just matrix multiplication essentially. The second one, statistical normalization, and then the third one, element-wise operations. So the second and the third are heavy vector optimized, or heavy vector heavy, vector operation heavy, and the first one is very much matrix multiplication, so n cube operations versus simply n or n square operations. And you can see that the tensor contractions are highly optimized. They are 99.8% of the floating point operations in the network, but only 61% of the runtime. Quite interesting, because these other 2 types of operations, which are usually have been ignored in the past a little bit because they're not matrix multiplication, so tensor units could not work with these operations. They're only 0.2% of the flops, but 40% of my runtime. So data movement is all you need. Data movement is the thing you want to optimize. And with our data movement-centric optimization, we achieved a 30% speed up over PyTorch, which translates immediately into a $3.6 million savings for GPT-3 training, or if you have a smaller network on the AWS cloud, about $85,000 for BERT, which is still a significant savings. So how did we do this? Well, we looked at the particular structure of the data flow of this network. We used the data-centric parallel programming framework that we're developing in the lab, which is available on GitHub, as you can see on the top right. We played with different data layouts for all the tensors. We played with different fusion strategies. In fact, we developed an optimized, near optimal selection scheme to select the right fusion and the right data layout in order to come up with the best possible schedule. And then we just combined the 2, fusion strategy and data layout, pretty much automatically, well in that paper manually, but now we can do it automatically, and we gain significant improvements or significant speed up compared to TensorFlow plus XLA, PyTorch, and even the hand optimized deep speed implementation. So deep speed's implementation is just hand optimized for that particular network on that particular GPU, and we were still able to beat them significantly. So in the last part, I want to focus on the high performance communication on very large clusters. So this is going to be slightly longer because we are targeting at very large scale parallelism. And so let me first talk about what are the various forms of parallelism. So parallelism in deep learning is actually 3-dimensional in some sense. So we can have various examples in mini batches. So this is mini batch number 1, mini batch number 2, and mini batch number 3. Each of those mini batches contains many, many examples. In this case, many, many images. So and there's a 4th mini batch as well. So then we can implement data parallelism. And the idea in data parallelism is that we copy the whole model to different accelerators. So this, of course, implies now that the whole model fits a different an accelerator. So a single accelerator can hold the full model. And here we have 3 different copies of the model, the green, the blue, and the red one, sitting on different accelerators. And now within each mini batch, we are selecting a single data item or a set of data items, actually sometimes called a micro batch, and run it through each of these accelerator chains in parallel, independently. And then at the end, once in the forward pass. So once the arrows are propagated backwards in this direction, these arrows now generate gradients that are local gradients at each of these nodes. But then in order to have a consistent model update so that all of the copies are equivalent after the backward pass, we need to sum all of these gradients in a global all reduction operation. So this is the global network bottleneck typically in simple deep learning, where you just employ this data parallelism, which is, by the way, still the most prevalent form of parallelism. But now, let's assume our model is too large, like I mentioned in the BERT case. Well, BERT is not too large, but in the GPT-3 case, 175 billion parameters in a reasonable data type, or not too small data type, is actually multiple gigabytes of data, so it may not fit my accelerator. Then I need to distribute the model itself. And one way to distribute the model is so-called pipeline parallelism, where I'm taking the first part of the model and putting it on a different accelerator like the second part. So you see the yellow and the reddish shaded area, and then the bluish shaded area. So as you can see, they go as a pipeline on 3 different accelerators. Now you already have a 2-dimensional form of parallelism. You can use data parallelism in this direction and pipeline parallelism in this direction. Sometimes these are also called vertical and horizontal parallelism, but these are quite confusing because it really depends on how you draw this vertical or horizontally, and I've seen both ways of drawing, so this is why I call this data parallelism and pipeline parallelism. So you can now already combine the two. There is a third form of parallelism, which is the operator, or sometimes called layer parallelism. Layer parallelism is a bit confusing. I prefer the term operator parallelism because, to me, pipeline parallelism is also some form of operator parallelism. By the way, these two forms, pipeline as well as operator parallelism, they are sometimes called model parallelism because those parallelize the model. But now back to operator parallelism. What does the operator parallelism do? Well, in a single operator, like this one we see on top here, it now distributes the computation of that operator. So here we are having the last layer of a ResNet style or of a CNN style deep neural network. So the last layer is typically a matrix multiplication, kind of a modified matrix multiplication, but very similar in communication properties. So we're just distributing that matrix multiplication to multiple accelerators. So now we have 3 different dimensions of parallelism. Data parallelism, where we distribute the whole model to different machines. I copy the whole model to different machines. Pipeline parallelism, where we distribute the model layer by layer or operator by operator. And then we have operator parallelism, where we take each operator and distribute it again to different machines. So you can see kind of a cubic data layout of these accelerators. So very large scale learning will actually need all 3 dimensions. And this depends on the exact model configuration, which of these 3 dimensions has which size, but the number of, the total number of nodes or accelerators employed is typically the product of those 3 different dimensions. We could now also talk about sparsity, but I think sparsity I'm excluding from this talk. It's a completely different topic, extremely exciting. I have actually written, together with some colleagues, a whole survey about the state of sparsity in deep learning. 124 pages is going to appear in the Journal of Machine Learning Research very soon. You can find it on arXiv today, and this summarizes sparsity as an opportunity. But let's stick to parallelism here. So what is a possible optimization for parallelism? What I just told you is just a setup in some sense. So now let's dive into data parallel. So data parallel is again where I'm copying the model in my previous drawing vertically to different accelerators, but each model holds the full accelerator. It turns out that about 90 to 99.9% of these gradient values can be skipped, do not need to be sent, and they can be sent in some later iteration, and it achieves very similar accuracy as if I'm sending them immediately. So somehow I can then just accumulate the remainder locally and not send most of those values. So there's actually a proof that a colleague Dan, a collaborator and colleague Dan Alistar developed, where you can show that this will actually converge in expectation. You can also show this empirically. This paper appeared at NIPS 2018, or NeurIPS 2018. And you can also show this for various types of networks like linear regression or a simple ResNet setup, that this also appears to work in practice. And of course, it is used in practice. There are many, many dozens, if not hundreds of papers using techniques similar to this one to show that gradient-based sparsification actually works. So I just mentioned sparsification. This is one particular form of sparsification, so-called communication sparsification. Okay, so we developed a framework on top of this to support the sparse communication, which we call SparseML. The idea here is that we have a sparse all reduction operation, where in this case we have 4 different nodes here. You can see them colored differently, green, here these 4 nodes. And then like a normal reduction operation first reduces with the neighbors in a butterfly pattern, and then the neighbors shift by a distance of 2, and so on. So a logarithmic number of stages. But now let's assume that the gradients have different sparsity patterns at each of those inputs. After each summation, of course, non-zeros and zeros result in non-zeros. So the sparsity is going to reduce, as we can see here in the white part. So whatever is white is sparse, whatever is black is non-zero, so it's not sparse. And so we will get more and more blackness, so we'll get fill-in towards the bottom of the operation. And here at the very bottom, it's of course the most fill-in. So somehow we need to optimize that implementation. So we need an implementation of all reduce, essentially MPI all reduce, that deals with the case that we have varying sparsity and fill-in in the operation itself. So we implemented all of this. If you want to know details, there are separate talks that explain this, or you can just look at the paper that appeared at SC19. The upshot of the whole result is that we were able to accelerate a specific Microsoft production workload from 2 weeks to 2 days by employing this form of sparsity. And then also, if you just look at the speed up on various machines, so for example, Pitt-Stein or the EC2 cluster. So on Pitt-Stein, we achieve 1.5, so 1.3 to about 3.6x speed up. On the EC2 cluster, which has a much weaker network, of course, we get a much higher speed up because gigabit Ethernet versus a high-performance computing network achieves a higher speed up. So this was trick number 1. Trick number 2 is actually aims at another problem. So some workloads are in fact quite unbalanced, which means that some examples take longer for processing than other examples. For example, video inputs. I have videos of different length, so each video is an example, but these examples are different length, and they may now vary in their processing time for the input. So here's a very particular data set, that's the YouTube data set, where the videos range from 29 to nearly 1800 frames. So the mean is 187 frames. You see the distribution, so there's a pretty long tail, and the standard deviation is actually about a little bit more than half the mean. So now if you look at the runtime on a P100, that shows a very similar distribution. So the standard deviation is now even larger with respect to the mean because of system effects. So what's happening here in synchronous SGD means that we will have different compute times, and then I will wait until I can run my all reduce. I'll wait for the last one here. This guy has computed last. So all the blue time is wasted essentially. Then in the next iteration, some other process will take longer because we are sampling randomly. And then everybody else is waiting for that one process to run the all reduce, and so on. And you see that the green is useful time, the red is the all reduce time, but the blue is essentially wasted waiting time in the synchronous SGD. What did we do? Well, we just invented the eager SGD, where we just use the statistical properties of the data and just say, well, we could start the SGD either after the first one arrives, like in this example, or after the majority arrives. So we just run the SGD on inconsistent data, like we basically did in the previous example with the sparsification. So we really just ignore the computation a little bit here and run it with mostly correct data. This works actually quite well in practice from a data science perspective, because the learning itself is a statistical process, and we employ some tricks to make it more accurate. We could implement this on smart NICs, like the streaming processing in the network devices that we have today. Furthermore, we get very good results on LSTMs, as I just mentioned. In fact, if we run the first triggers example, we get a 64% speed up, but the test accuracy is slightly lower, so we are losing a little bit of accuracy. But if we implement the majority triggering variant, so where we start the operation after the majority of the nodes arrive, not just the first one, then we get about the same accuracy and still a nearly 30% speed up. So the next step of this is now we can even relax this further. So we could even say, well, we can run this eager SGD as I just discussed. So we usually run it in the case when the majority of these nodes arrived. But we could just say, well, let's run something that is even weaker. Let's only run a subset of the nodes that communicate in each iteration. Like in this case here, out of these 6 nodes, only 3 nodes run the synchronization, and then the other 3 nodes run the sum, not the synchronization, run the sum. And then after several of those iterations, we are running a completely synchronous sum. So we are saving, again, in communication overhead and synchronization overhead in this case. So before in the eager SGD, we just save synchronization overhead. We still have the full communication. But here in WOGMA SGD, which is the weighted average group SGD, we're essentially only running this in groups, and then every now and then we run a full synchronization. So we can see that for deep reinforcement learning, where it's not really important to be strictly synchronous, because we can just pick up experience. So reinforcement learning has agents that gain their own experience. And so we can just pick up a subset of the experience and merge it into our own experience. And it's not so bad if we actually miss some experience, some gained by some agent, because we will likely get it later, latest in the fully asynchronous, in the fully synchronous step. And so we can see here that WOGMA SGD on 1024 nodes is the second fastest and significantly faster than 3 of those. And only the fully asynchronous SGD, which unfortunately doesn't really learn much, as we will see in the next plot, is faster. So if we now look at the actual quality over training time, so this is the score, so the higher the better, and the training time in hours here on the x-axis. So if you look at the quality, you can see the yellow one, which is this AD PSGD, the very fast one here. Unfortunately, it doesn't learn much because it's fully asynchronous. It basically doesn't communicate anything or much. And then the WOGMA SGD here is achieving the highest accuracy, because it achieves the higher accuracy even in terms of training time than the other ones, because it trains so much faster. Okay, so with that, I'm actually at the end of my talk, and I'm hoping that I can answer some questions, but let me just summarize the overall talk again. So we talked about high performance input-output, where the idea was that we use a trick that we can predict the deep learning workload because of the fixed seed. It's still random, but it's of course a pseudo-random. The second trick in terms of high-performance compute, we just see deep learning as a high-performance computing problem. We optimize the data movement of that high-performance computing problem like we would in any HPC setting, but it's actually quite a bit simpler than in many HPC settings, because these networks are usually fixed, so-called oblivious programs. So it means that the input to the network does not change the computation at all. Then in the last part, the most comprehensive part, I would say, is about high-performance communication. Very much like in deep learning, communication is the most complex workload we have to deal with. I mean, we know MPI in the communication context. In deep learning, it's relatively simple communication strategies, so we only have all reduce and point-to-point communication. I haven't talked about the pipelining schemes, but actually, if you look on our webpage or look at our YouTube channel, you will find various talks about very complex pipeline schemes by Shigang Li, who is one of my postdocs, and I just didn't have enough time to go into this. Instead, I talked about data parallelism, various forms of how to exploit asynchronity in data parallelism, and how to actually improve data parallelism. But there is much more to it that I don't have enough time to talk about here in this relatively short overview talk. So if you want to know more, please look at our papers here, some references on the slides. Send us an email or ask questions, or look at our YouTube channel of the SPCL lab, Scalable Parallel Computing Lab, where you can find many more talks and other things. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to receive questions.